don't think Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko understands how military conflicts work. You see, in an interview with Euronews, he said that Putin promised Lukashenko, the president of independent Belarus, that he could be the colonel of the Russian military. When the interviewer pressed him, saying, wouldn't this lead to everyone saying that Putin's just trying to recreate the USSR? Lukashenko didn't see the problem in that. And while this situation is comical, it does symbolize the very close relationship between Lukashenko's Belarus and Putin's Russia. And that's caught international eye because Reuters just 3 days ago explains that Lukashenko and Putin had a direct phone call on how to militarily deal with the conflict in Ukraine, which the West has taken notice. Because even if Lukashenko himself cannot join Russia's army, Al Jazeera on March 22nd points out that the Belarusian military could, considering that the conflict between Russia and the West in the battle in Ukraine is the largest conflict in decades and has the potential to become a third world war. We must ask, if Belarus were to join the fighting in Ukraine, how should the West respond? The answer is that the West should treat Belarus in the exact way they treated Russia. They can do so in three ways. First is by making sure Western countries don't put boots on the ground. Second is by implementing economic sanctions. And finally, is by using soft power to apply international diplomatic pressure. But the first way that the West could respond to Belarus getting involved more in the fighting in Ukraine is by making sure that Western countries don't put boots on the ground, because it would definitely escalate the conflict. As USA Today on February 27th points out, that Putin has outright said that he views an attack on Belarus, or even boots on the ground in Belarus, as not only a declaration of war, but an attack on Russia itself, which is incredibly concerning because Putin has already told those in charge of manning Russia's nuclear arsenal to be on high alert. And the Financial Times on March 19th puts this into a dangerous perspective, explaining that Lukashenko has already amended the Belarus constitution to allow for Putin to keep Russian nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil. Ultimately, Putin has laid the groundwork to allow for an attack on Belarus to give him the right or enough just cause to escalate the conflict to a nuclear one, which would be disastrous for the international community. Thus, the first thing that the West should do in terms of treating Belarus the same as Russia if they were to get involved in the Ukrainian conflict is to make sure that Western countries don't put boots on the ground. But the second way that the West could respond to Belarus putting in more military pressure into Russia and the Ukraine crisis is by implementing economic sanctions. Now, as Fortune magazine on March 8th points out that these sanctions have been incredibly effective. They state that the sanctions have worked so well that Russia could default on their loans to the international community as soon as the end of this month, which would put Russia in a very difficult spot financially. Applying these types of sanctions to Belarus would have a similar effect. And there would already be countries that would be backing the other Western countries that would apply the sanctions. Because as Global News just 2 hours ago explains, that the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada have already sanctioned Belarus, in addition to Australia. So, if Belarus were to escalate and get involved more militarily in the conflict in Ukraine, there would not only be an international established framework of applying sanctions to Belarus, but they would be incredibly effective, showing us the second way that the West could deal with Belarus increasing the military conflict in Ukraine. But the third and final way that Belarus, or that the West, could respond to Belarus joining the fighting in Ukraine is by using soft power to apply diplomatic pressure. As NPR on March 1st of this year explains, that this is actually what Ukraine, the people who are most affected by this conflict, want. Ukraine does not want this conflict to escalate any further, and they want the West to use soft power. But this also has international implications for the power balance of this conflict. Because as CNNBC explains on April 1st, that if the West would use diplomacy to make sure, if the West were to use diplomacy against Belarus, this would functionally serve as a methodology to prevent China and India, two nuclear countries with two of the largest populations on the globe, and then thus the largest military populations on the globe, from joining the conflict. So, if the West can use soft power, they can pull China and India to the West, shifting the power balance, showing the third and final way that the West can respond if Belarus were to join the fighting. Thus, when returning to today's question of if Belarus were to join the fighting in Ukraine, how should the West respond? The answer was to have the West treat Belarus the exact same way they treated Russia. First is by making sure that the Western countries don't put boots on the ground. Second is by applying international sanctions on an economic scale. And finally is by using soft power to apply diplomatic pressure on Belarus. Whether or not Lukashenko understands how war works, hopefully he won't be joining the military of Russia anytime soon.